Alright folks, so today we're going to look at Chapter 3, Section 4, which details the rise of civilization in China. This is the last of the 4 river valley civilizations that you guys were responsible for. The first one we looked at was Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Middle East. We then looked at Egypt with the Nile River. We have since looked at India and the Indus River Valley along with the Ganges River Valley. And the last river valley civilization that we need to look at is China, and that begins in some of the river valleys there as well. So our lesson objectives for this, first of all, is to understand how geography influenced early Chinese civilization. The geography of this area of the world is really important to how China developed its own unique civilization different from everybody else's. We're then going to analyze how Chinese culture took shape under the Shang and Zhou dynasties. One of the most important things to understand about Chinese history is the fact that dynasties ruled for long periods of time in China. The first two dynasties, these families that ruled China for long periods of time, were known as the Shang and Zhou dynasties. We're then going to describe the religions and belief systems that developed in China. So, for example, specifically Daoism and Confucianism. These are two different types of philosophies. They're not really religions. They're more belief systems than anything else. They're more philosophies, ways of thinking about the world. All right, so we'll look at Daoism and Confucianism. Then we're going to look at and list some achievements made in early China. Right. So what are some of the things that the early Chinese civilization achieved and allowed, and we are able to use today in later civilizations. So first of all, looking at their geography, much of the Chinese geography, the most important part of it is that there are a lot of geographic barriers that isolate China from other parts of the world. So when we go to the west and the southwest, we have these very high mountain ranges. You have the Tian Shan Mountains, and then you also have the Himalaya Mountains, which we talked about when we talked about India, right? We said the Himalaya Mountains were a barrier between India and China. So when we're talking about China, they're a barrier between China and India as well. In the southeast, you have these thick rainforests. In countries today where these rainforests are located are countries like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. If you ever seen photographs of these countries, most of the countries are made up of rainforests. So there's these really thick rainforests, which also act as a barrier. They're not very easy to walk through and so on. So they act as a barrier similar to mountains, similar to deserts. Right. In the north, we have this desert called the Gobi Desert, which we will talk a little bit more about in class. But like any desert, it's very dry, and it keeps people, it's a barrier and keeps people from the north from getting into China, from China getting out of China and going to the north, the northern part of Asia. One interesting thing about the Gobi Desert is it's a fairly cold desert. There's a lot of ice and some snow, but it is very dry. It does not rain hardly at all throughout the year, so not much grows there. Nobody lives there, and it does act as a barrier just like any other desert, even though it's cold and not hot like most deserts that we've talked about or you've seen before. And then in the east, right, you have the Pacific Ocean, right, which at the time period that we're talking about is a barrier. These civilizations did not have boats that could safely cross oceans or go very far over oceans. So the Pacific Ocean, just like mountains, just like deserts, just like these rainforests, acted as a barrier as well. Kept people in China and kept people out of China. And so looking at this map to show you some of these different barriers, right, to show you how China is isolated. In the south and the east, we have the Tian Shan Mountains, which would be these mountains here, and then we have the Himalaya Mountains, the very high ones, snow-covered mountains that are a barrier between China and then India. We then go to the south, and that's where we have the rainforest. So countries like Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia and Burma are thick rainforest there, keeps people out of China from those countries. And then we have the Gobi Desert in the north, which keeps people from the north from coming into China and people from China from going into the Gobi Desert and into the northern part of Asia. And then lastly, we have the East China Sea, which is part of the Pacific Ocean. It acts as a barrier as well, keeps people out of China at this time, keeps people in China. China is also known for having varied regions. So two of the most important ones are the river valleys. The river valleys are where the first civilization started in China. That's where people settled down, just like, for much of the same reasons that people settled down in river valleys anywhere else in the world. Right? They used the water for transportation, used the water and the floodwaters from the silt that it brought with it, so that they could farm and produce enough food to support a growing population. There are then these other two provinces called Xinjiang and Mongolia, and in these places there were harsh climates and they were inhabited by nomads. Especially from Mongolia, there are these group of people there called the Mongolians who constantly attack the Chinese living in the river valleys. And the next section that is something we're going to mention when we talk about the Great Wall of China, and then later in the year when we talk about the Mongolian empires. They conquered China eventually. Right? These group of people who are moving around from place to place, they are constantly attacking the Chinese who are living in the river valleys. So the most important of the river valleys was the Huang River, or it is also known as the Yellow River, and this is where we first see Chinese civilization. This is just a photograph of the Yellow River. It's given the name the Yellow River because the water is pretty murky. It does carry with it a lot of silt, which makes the water look a little bit yellowish or brownish in color. We then go to looking at the early dynasties. So particularly here we're talking about the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. Now, the first dynasty in China was the Shang dynasty, and they ruled for about 600 years. So again, a dynasty is a family that rules a country for a long period of time. So in China for about 600 years, one family were in charge. Right? So anybody who was a member of the Shang dynasty became the different emperors and ruled for over 600 years. Now again, comparing that to the history of the United States, the history of the United States is relatively short compared to even just this one dynasty in China. And there were dozens of Chinese dynasties throughout its history. They were eventually overthrown by the Zhou dynasty around 1122 BC, and that's what we see. Throughout Chinese history, we see this constant, what we're going to call a dynastic cycle, where one dynasty rules for a long time, they eventually get kicked out, another family comes in, another dynasty comes in, takes over, and then they rule for a long time before they are kicked out. So looking at this timeline, you can see there's a bunch of dynasties on this timeline going all the way up to modern times, right, 2000 AD or so, or in 2013 this year. But you have a dozen or so Chinese dynasties that ruled for long periods of time throughout Chinese history. So at the very first, right, we have the Shang and the Zhou. Now the Zhou dynasty, they justified their overthrow of the Shang by promoting the idea of this thing called the mandate of heaven, which simply means the divine right to rule. So we talked about divinity, we talked about what it means to be divine when we talked about Egypt earlier in the year. Right? When we said the pharaohs were divine, they were seen as being part God. So the emperors in China, the dynasties in China, claimed this mandate of heaven, basically saying that the gods were the ones who gave them the right to rule. This is very important. Now, again, what we have here in Chinese history can be boiled down to this one cycle that we call the dynastic cycle. And what happens in the dynastic cycle is that a new dynasty, right, like in this case, the Zhou dynasty, claims the mandate of heaven. Right? They come in and say that the gods have given their family the right to rule, and they have to try and get the people to believe that. Now, in order to do that, right, they have to do some things that makes it so that the people like them. So they first of all bring about peace, because there was probably a war going on between the two dynasties who were vying for power. So when they win that war, they bring peace with them. They rebuild the infrastructure, meaning they rebuild the roads and the bridges and the canals and all those things. They also decide to give land to peasants. So they take land away from a lot of the rich people in China and give it to the peasants. What this does is makes it so that a lot of people in China are happy with this new dynasty. Right? It'd be like the President of the United States taking a bunch of money away from very wealthy people and then giving everybody else in the United States $40,000 or $50,000. Right? People would like that president for doing that. The people who were very wealthy would not like that, but the majority of people who were given the $40,000 or $50,000 would really like that president in this case. So similar to that, right, the dynasties don't have money to give, but they take land away, which land for these peasants is a life changer. They can now farm and produce their own food on their own land and not have to rent it or not borrow it from wealthier people. And they also protect the people. Now, what ends up happening is things go really well for a long time. Generations go by. There are dozens of emperors that are ruling these dynasties over a long period of time. But however, the new dynasty becomes then the old dynasty. And they stop doing the good things that people like. And they start doing things that people don't like. So they start, for example, taxing people too much. Not just taking money away from the very wealthy people or land away from the very wealthy people, they are now taxing everybody too much. And if you ask your parents about taxes, if there's anything that they hate about the government, it's that they have to pay a lot in taxes usually. They also stop protecting the people. Right? So they start spending less on the military and stop protecting people from invaders. They let the infrastructure decay, so they let the roads and the bridges kind of start falling apart. Rather than spend money on fixing them, they keep the money for themselves. And they also start treating people unfairly, so they start like arresting people for no reason. They start putting people in prison for no reason, and they start doing things that the government should not be doing. So what ends up happening then is that the people lose faith in these dynasties, and the old dynasty loses its mandate of heaven. They no longer have the right to rule by the people, the right to rule from the gods, or so the people believe. And at the same time, usually what happens is there are problems going on. There might be floods or earthquakes or other natural disasters. You have peasants who start revolting because they're getting treated so unfairly. They're getting taxed to death. They're starving to death. Invaders attack the empire. So people like the Mongolians from the north were constantly attacking, and that causes some problems. And then you have bandits raid the countryside. So criminals, right, raiding the countryside, stealing from people, murdering people, and it's just not a good place to be at this time period in the life cycle of these dynasties. So we go back to the beginning, right? There's a rebellion usually, and then one powerful family kicks out the old dynasty, and you have a new dynasty that takes over. And you have the cycle repeating all over again. So the new dynasty claims the mandate of heaven. They start doing good things. A long time goes by, and they start doing bad things. They get kicked out. They lose their mandate of heaven, and a new family takes their place. And this happens, again, like I said, dozens of times throughout Chinese history. All right, so next we're going to look at some of the belief systems that develop in ancient China. You have these two philosophies. One's called Daoism or Taoism, and then one is called Confucianism. Neither of these belief systems are what we would call a religion. They don't believe in gods or anything like that, but it's more a philosophy. It's more a way of thinking about the world and how you should act while you're living in this world. So there's not a lot about heaven or hell or a lot about gods or the afterlife or anything in these philosophies, but it's more about how you should act and how you should live as a person in this world. So first we'll look at Confucianism. That is the more important of the two. You will find more questions on the Regents. There will be more questions that I ask you about Confucianism. But basically, in Confucianism, you have this guy named Confucius, right? This very wise, intelligent philosopher and teacher that developed this philosophy, like I said, instead of a religion. And this philosophy becomes known as Confucianism. So it's named after him. It's like Christianity is named after Jesus Christ. Confucianism is named after a real person named Confucius. Now, this philosophy focuses on social order and good government, meaning you need to follow the rules. Right? There has to be rules, and people need to follow them. If there are no rules or people don't follow the rules, then you have problems. And you also have to have good government, meaning the government needs to be just. The government needs to be a good government. They're not treating people unfairly. They're not treating people harshly or anything like that. But they do have rules, and they expect people to follow their rules. That would be Confucius' ideal society. Now, in this philosophy, he developed something called the 5 relationships. He believed that all relationships could be broken up into 5 different categories. And in all of these relationships, there was one person who was superior and one person who was inferior. So for example, we'll look at the first one, right? We have ruler to subject. So in this relationship, you have the ruler, who is the superior person, and then you have the subject, who is the inferior. Next relationship, we have parent to child. Again, here we have the parent, who is the superior member of this relationship, and then you have the child, who's the inferior member of this relationship. Parents get to tell children what to do. Children have to listen. Husband to wife. Right now, today in our society, we tend to think this is more equal, but in this time period, the husband was the superior and the wife was the inferior in this relationship. Husbands were allowed to tell their wives what to do, and wives were expected to listen and respect their husbands. We then go to older brother to younger brother, and this could be older person to younger person, older sister to younger sister. This is just respecting your elders, right? Older brother to younger brother. The older brother here is the superior person in the relationship. The younger brother or younger person is the inferior. And in Chinese society and Chinese culture still today, you are taught to respect your elders. Right? Treat them with respect and listen to them. They are wiser. They have been on earth longer. They know more. So you should listen to them. And then the last relationship is the only relationship that is supposed to be equal. Right? In this relationship, Confucius says this is the only one where you're allowed to be equal. There is no superior or inferior member of this relationship when you have friend to friend. Friends are supposed to be equal. Now, the idea behind this is that Confucius believed that everyone had duties and responsibilities, and that you had to have correct behavior. And if you had correct behavior, that would bring order and stability. So in all these relationships, if you listen to the person who is superior to you, and they are just, right, then that brings order, that brings stability, that makes a society run efficiently and run well. Now, in all these relationships, the person who was superior was expected to be good. So like with ruler to subject, rulers were expected to be good. They could not treat people unfairly. Right? In return, they were given respect and loyalty by their subjects. So same thing with father to son. A father can tell a child what to do or to tell a son what to do, but if he tells him to jump off a bridge or something like that, that the son would be expected to not respect his father, not listen, and respect his wishes in that case. Right? If it's a good rule or a just rule, then the subjects, the inferior people in these relationships, were expected to follow them. But only if they were good. Only if they were good rules. If they were unjust rules, they weren't expected to be followed in Confucius's philosophy. We then go to Daoism or Taoism. Now, Taoism is kind of the opposite of Confucius. There's a guy named Lao Tzu who came up with this philosophy. Confucius and Lao Tzu did not live at the same time, but they lived around the same time. And Lao Tzu and his philosophy of Daoism or Taoism was all about harmony in nature. So when you think of Lao Tzu, think of like hippies. Right? In the hippie culture, right, it's all about harmony in nature. And in this philosophy, he did not care about order and stability. He did not care about rules. He, in fact, did not like rules at all. He would say rules were man-made things that were never part of nature. Right? They're man-made, so since they're man-made, you don't need them. So he believed that government was the cause of most of the world's problems. It was unnatural. Government was not something that came from nature. Government was something that was created by humans over a long period of time. And since it was created by humans, it wasn't natural. Right? It was not found in nature, so therefore did not need to be a part of society. All right, and lastly, we're going to look at some of the early Chinese achievements, one of which we're going to talk more about with something we're going to call the Silk Road in the next chapter. But they had silk making. Right? They were the only place in the world at this time that had the ability to make this material called silk, which is a very silky, soft fabric that would be used to make either blankets or clothing. Once people started trading with China and found out that there was silk there, they were willing to spend a lot of money to make to bring the silk back to their home countries and sell it there and make a lot of money off of it. So let's see if this video works. I'm not sure if this is going to play or not. If it does, I'll just give you a few seconds to watch this. This shows you silk being made. Silk comes from these little worms called silkworms. The silk needs to be extracted from them. So what you're seeing here is this guy taking the worm, extracting all the silk, throwing the worm out, and then stretching the silk out. It's pretty amazing how much silk stretches out. So you keep doing this and doing this and doing this until you had a piece of fabric like the one that he has there. This would then be dyed and cut and sewed and different things like that and turned into a piece of clothing. All right, we then have complex writing. In Chinese culture, they developed a very complex writing system. Each word had its own symbol. There are literally millions of different symbols in Chinese writing. Here's some examples of them, different family members, right? Some of the different symbols for family members. It was not an alphabet, right? Each word, each idea, and different things like that had its own symbol. So it was very difficult writing to learn, and still is a very difficult language to learn for most people who have not grown up in China. There's just so many words and so many symbols out there. It's hard for people to learn. We then have the first books, which come from this very complex writing system. The first books were written on pieces of bamboo and strapped together to form the first binded book. So obviously the pages would be quite a bit thicker since they're made of bamboo rather than paper material. These are really the world's first books, right? Something that looks like a book that we would use today in class, or you would read at home or take out from the library. All right, so that is it for this podcast. We'll be talking about a lot of this stuff in class, particularly Confucianism and Daoism. So make sure you fill in the guided notes, and I will see you guys in class. Have a good day.